In the spring of 1893, a man stood on a bridge in Kristiania and painted the sky blood red. This is not metaphor. According to conservation records at the National Museum of Norway from 2012, spectroscopic analysis of the pigment layers in Edvard Munch's The Scream reveals cadmium yellow, vermillion, and synthetic ultramarine applied with visible finger marks pressed directly into wet paint. The brushwork in the sky shows no hesitation. Letters preserved at the Munch Museum, dated to January 1892, describe Munch walking along Ekeberg Hill at sunset when he felt what he called a great scream passing through nature. A diary entry from that same winter, catalogued in the museum's archive as MMN2760, reads, "I felt a great scream, and I actually heard, a scream." This is not fiction. This is what this painting still reveals. What this work tells us goes far beyond one man's anxiety on a bridge. It speaks to something deeper about how terror moves through a body, how a sunset can feel like the end of everything, and how a single image can capture what an entire generation could not yet name. For decades, curators and psychologists have returned to this painting, trying to understand why it lodges so completely in memory, why the figure's open mouth seems to pull sound from silence, and why the sky looks like it is dissolving. The central question that has haunted scholars since the painting's first exhibition in 1893 is this: how did Munch make visible something most people spend their lives trying not to feel? If you are listening to this between 10 at night and 3 in the morning, you have found the right place. This is a space for depth, for the kind of art story that rewards patience and curiosity. If you feel moved by what you hear tonight, I would love to know which detail caught you most. You can leave a comment below. And if you want more of these late-night walks through art and history, please subscribe. It helps this channel reach others who are searching, like you are now, for something true and quietly profound. Let us step closer now to the canvas and to the man who made it. You are standing in front of The Scream in Gallery 24 of the National Museum in Oslo. It is past closing, and the lights have been dimmed. The room smells faintly of humidity control systems and old parquet. The painting is smaller than you expected, just 91 centimeters tall, tempera and crayon on cardboard. If you lean close, which the guards would never allow, you would see how rough the surface is, how the figure in the foreground is barely more than a skull wrapped in fabric, how the two figures in the background on the bridge recede into shadow as though they have already forgotten what the screaming figure is seeing. The colors are more violent up close. The sky is not just orange. It is cadmium orange and chrome yellow and scarlet lake bleeding together, with streaks of blue where the fjord water reflects the chaos above. The whole composition curves inward toward the open mouth, like the world is being swallowed into one moment of soundless terror. And there, in the lower left corner, almost invisible unless you know to look, is a pencil inscription. It reads, in Norwegian, "Can only have been painted by a madman." The handwriting is Munch's own. He added it years later, after critics said the same thing. The revelation here is that the artist agreed with them. He painted the accusation onto his own work and left it there for us to find. In the winter of 1892, Kristiania, soon to be renamed Oslo, was a city caught between two centuries. Norway was still under Swedish rule, restless with the energy of a nation that knew independence was coming, but did not yet know when. The cultural life of the city centered on the Grand Café, on Karl Johans Gate, where writers, painters, and anarchists met in smoke-filled rooms to argue about Ibsen's plays, the morality of free love, and the future of Norwegian identity. Edvard Munch was 30 years old that winter. He had spent the previous 2 years in Paris and Berlin, absorbing the influence of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, but he had not yet found his visual language. His earlier work, landscape studies and family portraits, showed technical skill, but little urgency. He was known in the small community of Norwegian painters as competent, not dangerous. The art world Munch moved through operated under strict rules. To succeed as a painter meant exhibiting at the annual autumn exhibition in Kristiania, securing a state travel stipend, and eventually earning a commission from a wealthy family or the government. The Royal School of Drawing, where Munch had studied in the early 1880s, taught academic realism, copying plaster casts of Greek sculpture, working from life models posed in classical positions. Innovation was tolerated only within narrow boundaries. Christian Krogh, one of Munch's early mentors, had pushed the limits by painting working-class subjects, prostitutes and dock workers. But even Krogh's work remained tethered to naturalism. No one in Norway had yet made a painting that looked the way a panic attack feels. Beneath the surface of the city's polite exhibitions and literary salons, darker currents moved. Tuberculosis was epidemic. Munch's mother had died from it when he was 5. His older sister Sophie had died of the same disease when she was 15, an event Munch would return to obsessively in his work for the rest of his life. According to medical records held at the National Library of Norway, tuberculosis mortality rates in Kristiania in the 1880s reached nearly 400 deaths per 100,000 residents annually, making it the leading cause of death among adults. Munch grew up in a household where illness was not an exception but a permanent condition, where the smell of sickness and the sound of coughing at night were as normal as breakfast. His father, Christian Munch, was a military doctor who treated the poor and carried his own fear of divine punishment like a stone in his chest. He believed his children were cursed. In a letter dated August 1889, held at the Munch Museum and catalogued as MMT 2771, Edvard wrote to a friend, "My father is insane with religion. He believes we are all doomed." This was the air the young painter breathed: grief, guilt, and an unshakable feeling that catastrophe was always one breath away. By the autumn of 1891, Munch had begun experimenting with what he called soul painting, trying to break free from the objective observation that naturalism demanded. He wanted to paint memory, not eyesight. In October of that year, according to exhibition records from the autumn exhibition in Kristiania, Munch submitted a painting titled Melancholy, showing a lone figure slumped on a beach at dusk, the sky tinged with unnatural green and yellow. Critics were confused. A review published in Verdens Gang on November 3, 1891, described the painting as unpleasant and formless, lacking the clarity and finish expected of a serious artist. But something had shifted. Munch was no longer interested in finish. He wanted to show what it felt like to be alive in a body that remembers every loss it has ever suffered. In late January 1892, Munch took the walk that would define his career. He was with 2 friends, though he does not name them in his written accounts. According to the diary entry preserved at the Munch Museum, they were walking along the road that runs above the Kristiania fjord, near Ekeberg Hill, at sunset. The sky began to change color, shifting from blue to orange to red, the kind of red that happens only when atmospheric conditions align in a particular way. Volcanic dust from the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, nearly a decade earlier, was still circulating in the upper atmosphere, creating sunsets across Europe and Scandinavia that were described in meteorological records as unnaturally vivid, streaked with crimson and gold. Munch stopped walking. His friends continued ahead. In his diary, Munch writes, "I felt a great scream passing through nature. I seemed to hear the scream. I painted this picture, painted the clouds as actual blood. The color shrieked." The diary entry is brief, but its precision is unnerving. He does not say he screamed. He says he heard nature scream. The distinction matters. What he experienced on that bridge was not personal terror, but something larger, something environmental, as though the world itself had become unbearable. Within a few weeks, Munch had begun work on the first version of what would eventually be known as the Scream. That first version, now in the collection of the National Museum, was painted in tempera and crayon on cardboard. The choice of cardboard was not poverty or accident. According to conservation reports published by the National Museum in 2020, the cardboard support allowed Munch to work quickly, to capture the raw immediacy of the memory without the delay and formality that oil on canvas would require. He wanted the painting to feel like it had been made in one breath. The composition is radically simple. A bridge cuts diagonally across the canvas, a wooden railing running from lower left to upper right. Two dark figures stand far back on the bridge, their forms reduced to silhouettes, indifferent or unaware. In the foreground, the screaming figure occupies the center, hands pressed to the sides of its head, mouth open, eyes wide. The body is almost skeletal, androgynous, wearing what appears to be a dark coat that melts into the swirling background. The sky takes up more than half the canvas, a vortex of red, orange, and yellow that spirals around the horizon line where the fjord meets the hills. The water below is rendered in thick, undulating strokes of blue and green, as though it, too, is in motion, responding to the scream. Every line in the painting curves. There are no straight edges, no stability. The world itself is bending under the weight of what the figure feels. Munch exhibited the painting for the first time in December 1893 at an exhibition in Berlin, organized by the Verein Berliner Künstler, the Association of Berlin Artists. The exhibition was meant to showcase contemporary Scandinavian art, but when the jury saw Munch's submissions, they were horrified. According to minutes from a committee meeting held on November 11th, 1893, preserved in the archives of the National Gallery in Berlin, several members argued that Munch's paintings were unfinished, offensive to decency, and an insult to art. The exhibition opened anyway, but within a week, the scandal had grown so intense that the entire show was shut down. Critics called Munch's work degenerate. One review, published in the Berliner Tageblatt on November 8, 1893, described the Scream as the product of a diseased mind. Another, from a conservative art journal, said the painting abandons all principles of beauty and order in favor of chaos. But in Berlin's avant-garde circles, the scandal made Munch famous overnight. Young artists who were tired of academic painting saw in Munch's work a new possibility, a way to paint the interior life, the psychological and emotional states that realism could never touch. Within months, Munch had been invited to exhibit in Paris and Munich. The painting that the Berlin jury wanted to hide became the painting everyone needed to see. By 1895, Munch had created 4 versions of the Scream, 2 in paint and 2 in lithograph, each one slightly different in composition and color, each one an attempt to refine or intensify the original vision. What contemporaries missed, and what only became visible through later analysis, was how much the painting's impact depends on its materials. In 2012, conservators at the National Museum used infrared reflectography and X-ray fluorescence to study the painting's layers. What they discovered, documented in the journal Studies in Conservation, was that Munch had applied the paint in a way that defied convention. He did not build up the image in careful, logical stages, starting with an underdrawing and then adding layers of color. Instead, he worked wet into wet, dragging pigment across the cardboard with his fingers, smearing colors together so that the boundaries between sky, water, and figure dissolve. In several areas, the crayon lines were added on top of wet paint, creating a waxy resist that made the lines stand out even more starkly. The painting was not crafted. It was made in a state of urgency that is still legible in the brushwork. The business infrastructure that allowed Munch to survive as an artist during this period was fragile and often exploitative. He had no dealer in Kristiania and depended on a small circle of collectors who bought work on credit or in exchange for dinners and lodging. According to account books preserved at the Munch Museum, Munch sold the Scream lithographs between 20 and 50 kroner each, roughly the equivalent of a week's wages for a skilled worker in 1895. He sold the original painted version only once, in 1895, to a Norwegian collector named Olav Sko for 300 kroner, a sum that barely covered Munch's debts from that year. The painting did not make Munch wealthy. It made him visible. And visibility in the world of late 19th century European art was both a gift and a trap. Between 1895 and 1900, Munch produced an enormous body of work, much of it exploring themes of anxiety, death, and desire. He painted The Sick Child 5 times, reworking his memory of his sister's death. He painted Madonna, a half-nude woman surrounded by a halo of red and a border of spermatozoa and embryos, a painting that was censored in several exhibitions for its erotic and blasphemous content. He painted The Dance of Life, a vision of men and women locked in cycles of attraction and rejection. But no matter what he painted, critics and audiences returned to The Scream as the definitive image of his vision. By 1902, when Munch exhibited 22 paintings under the title The Frieze of Life at the Berlin Secession, The Scream had become the anchor of his reputation. It was the painting people traveled to see, the one that confirmed or refuted everything they believed about modern art. The cost of this success was his sanity. Munch drank heavily. He entered into volatile relationships with women that ended in public scenes and private devastation. In 1902, he began a relationship with Tulla Larsen, the daughter of a wealthy wine merchant. According to letters exchanged between Munch and Larsen, held at the Munch Museum and catalogued under the Tulla Larsen correspondence file, their relationship was intense and destructive. In 1903, during an argument at a gathering in the coastal town of Åsgårdstrand, a gun was fired. The details remain disputed, but Munch lost part of a finger on his left hand. He blamed Larsen. She blamed him. The Kuisåsar incident became a public scandal, reported in Norwegian newspapers, with the kind of detail usually reserved for crime stories. Munch withdrew further from social life, painting obsessively, drinking more, sleeping less. By 1908, Munch's mental state had deteriorated to the point of collapse. In October of that year, he checked himself into Dr. Daniel Jacobson's nerve clinic in Copenhagen. Medical records from the clinic, preserved at the Munch Museum, described Munch as suffering from hallucinations, paranoia, and what we would now recognize as severe anxiety and possible psychosis. He stayed in the clinic for 8 months. During that time, he was not allowed to paint. The treatment involved rest, regulated meals, and electrotherapy, a common treatment for nervous disorders in the early 20th century. It was brutal. But when Munch emerged in May 1909, he claimed he was cured. He returned to Norway, settled in Ekeberg, a property outside Oslo, and continued to paint until his death in 1944. But he never painted another version of the scream. The image had done its work. It had carved a channel through his psyche and through the culture that could not be painted again. What institutions and critics failed to understand in Munch's lifetime was that the scream was not a painting about madness. It was a painting about what it feels like to be sane in a world that is breaking apart. The figure on the bridge is not insane. The figure is the only one who sees clearly. The two people in the background, walking calmly, represent the social world, the world of small talk and daily routine, the world that refuses to acknowledge the scream passing through nature. The screaming figure is isolated, not because it is sick, but because it is awake. This interpretation, articulated most clearly by art historian Reinhold Heller in his 1984 monograph, Munch, His Life and Work, reframes the painting from a document of personal neurosis into a critique of collective denial. The painting asks, what does it mean to hear what others refuse to hear? Institutional response to Munch's work during his lifetime oscillated between censorship and canonization. In 1912, the Sonderbund exhibition in Cologne gave Munch an entire room, a recognition of his influence on German expressionism. But in 1937, during the Nazi regime's campaign against so-called degenerate art, 82 of Munch's works were confiscated from German museums. Several were destroyed. Others were sold at auction to raise funds for the regime. According to records from the degenerate art auctions held in Lucerne in 1939, archived at the Getty Research Institute, at least 3 versions of Munch's lithographs of The Scream were sold to private buyers, their provenance lost in the chaos of war. The painting that had been condemned in 1893 as an insult to art was condemned again in 1937 for the same reason. It told a truth that those in power could not tolerate. In 1994, one version of The Scream, the tempera and crayon painting held at the National Gallery in Oslo, was stolen during the Winter Olympics. 2 men broke through a window, cut the painting from the wall, and left a note that read, "Thanks for the poor security." The painting was recovered 3 months later in a sting operation. Then, in 2004, another version, this one held at the Munch Museum, was stolen in broad daylight by armed men who threatened museum staff and visitors. That version was not recovered until 2006. When it was finally returned, conservators discovered that it had been damaged, the paint surface scratched and torn in several places. Restoration work, documented in the Munch Museum's conservation report from 2008, took 2 years. The painting survived, but it carries scars now, marks of violence that are part of its history. What we have learned from The Scream, and what we are still learning, is that images of terror have a strange power. They do not lose their force over time. They do not become decorative or safe. The painting has been reproduced so many times on posters and coffee mugs and emoji that it has entered the realm of cliché. But when you stand in front of the original, in that quiet gallery in Oslo, the cliché falls away. What you see is the record of a moment when one person stopped walking and let the world break open. The painting is not a metaphor. It is a document. It is proof that the scream Munch heard that day in 1892 is still audible, still moving through the air, still waiting for someone to stop and listen. What remains unresolved, even now, is whether the painting offers any comfort. Scholars debate this. Some argue that by making the scream visible, Munch gave form to something formless, and that the act of making it visible is itself a kind of relief. Others argue that the painting offers no relief at all, that it simply shows us what we already know and would rather not see, that beneath the surface of ordinary life, terror is always present, always waiting. The painting does not answer this question. It holds the question open. Think about the hand that painted this, the hand that pressed pigment into cardboard with enough force to leave fingerprints. Think about the winter light in Kristiania in 1892, the cold coming off the fjord, the smell of coal smoke and damp wool. Think about what it means to carry an image like this inside your body for months before you can get it out. Munch did not paint the scream to communicate an idea. He painted it because he had no choice. The image had to come out, or it would have destroyed him. And maybe it did destroy him, slowly, over decades. But it also gave the rest of us a way to see what we could not see before. It gave us a language for the feeling that comes when the sky turns red and the ground seems to tilt, and the only sound is a sound you cannot make. If you are listening to this late at night, in the dark, maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you have stood on your own bridge and felt the scream pass through. And if you have, then you know why this painting matters. Not because it is beautiful, not because it is famous, but because it is true. Because it says, this happened, this is real. You are not alone in this. Somewhere in a museum in Oslo, there is a piece of cardboard covered in pigment that proves someone else felt it too and had the courage or the recklessness to make it visible. That is the gift Munch left us. Not comfort, exactly, but witness. The painting says, I saw it, I heard it, and now, so do you. And that is where we will leave it tonight. With that small, rough piece of cardboard and the man who stood on a bridge in 1893 and painted the sky the color of blood, and the scream that is still, if you listen closely, moving through the world.